Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So, taking another fun and interesting episode for you guys this evening as we're doing one last follow-up to the Nintendo versus Tropical Haze lawsuit. There's some more interesting information to go over. I've been getting a lot of questions in the comments about what happens moving forward, and I was recently chatting with Mr. Sujano, the emulation news expert on YouTube, with a voice that sounds like warm honey, and we were talking a little bit more about what this means moving forward. So I figured I would clarify some points and kind of expand onto a lot of your guys' questions, because obviously the news last week was Nintendo sued Yuzu, and the Yuzu Corporation, which is actually known as Tropical Haze, settled for $2.4 million and said that they would no longer develop or distribute the Yuzu and Citra emulators. But there's a crap ton of details if you read between the lines. I've been getting a lot of questions about them, so that's what we're going to go over today. What happens to Yuzu and emulation in general moving forward. Because I've been getting a lot of comments seeing forks of Yuzu. We have Nuzu, Suyu. I've also seen Zuzu and Buzu. Now that's not to say all of these forks are going to see active development, but if you want to go and download the emulator today, it is still available. Because Tropical Haze halted the development of the Yuzu emulator. That means the team behind Yuzu proper is no longer going to be developing the emulator. They're not going to be working on any of the source code. They're not going to be distributing it or otherwise touching it for Yuzu or Citra. That is the settlement they made with Nintendo, but we need to break that down and explain what that means for everyone else going forward. Because Nintendo just sued Tropical Haze, it is a lawsuit between one company and another company, and it's a lawsuit that saw a settlement, not an actual court determination. And if you go over the actual initial legal filing between Nintendo and Tropical Haze, you're going to see the defendant is just named as Tropical Haze. But the thing about the Yuzu emulator is it was always open source, which means you could download the depositories on GitHub, you could see all of the work, all of the code, and continue to work on it in your spare time if you wanted to contribute to the Yuzu project, or if you wanted to fork the project into your own repro and your own emulator. And just going over open source, if that's not something you're familiar with, this basically means that the source code for any sort of development is publicly made available. You can download it, you can read through it, you can parse what it means, and you can take snippets of that entire code and use it for your own application, so long as that's not usually a commercial product. And it's not like any of these emulators suddenly stopped functioning. This is me playing Ridge Racer 3D on the Citra emulator after Tropical Haze settled with Nintendo. This is still totally fine to do. You can find the software, I own the game and the handheld. And you're going to see here in the details we went over last time, the settlement that was proposed. The developers supported Nintendo and said that they would cease development effective immediately. The developers of Yuzu, Tropical Haze, are no longer going to be working on the emulator. They're no longer going to be hosting any files online. You can't download it from them, and none of the team members that would have been named in this settlement are able to develop the Yuzu emulator anymore. They even say that they're disappointed that it was used for leaks, but that honestly is just a statement. It has no legal binding matter in it whatsoever. And this is part of the settlement here as well, the $2.4 million. But what I need you to understand is this settlement is just between Nintendo and Tropical Haze. No developer from that team can continue to work on the emulator. But where does that leave the other billions of human beings on Earth that could possibly want to do something like use Citra or develop for Citra or Yuzu? It leaves them free and clear to do whatever the hell they want because they are not a party to the settlement. The settlement is exclusively between Nintendo the Corporation and Tropical Haze, and that comes down to setting a precedent. This court case, as we discussed in the previous video, never went before a judge or a jury. There was never any decision made on whether or not Nintendo's legal argument held any water and could be used in citing cases going forward. This is just a deal between two parties, and everyone who is not a party to this settlement, everyone who's not Tropical Haze or Nintendo, is still allowed to develop any sort of Switch emulator they would like, any sort of 3DS emulator they would like, or any sort of Switch 2 emulator they would like, and we'll get into that later in the video, why I actually think Nintendo did this in the first place. But again, you just need to remember a settlement does not set a precedent, and that means this is not binding for anyone other than the members of the Tropical Haze team. It doesn't matter what Nintendo said in their lawsuit, none of this was decided upon by a judge. That means it is just a private deal between individuals and Nintendo as a corporation. And that's why you're going to see Switch emulators Emulation, 3DS Emulation continue on into the future, because no one who's making an emulator for these devices that did not work or benefit from Tropical Haze is in any way, shape, or form a party to this settlement. They are free and clear to do whatever they want, and they will. And we talked about how strong the legal case was against Yuzu. I still think it was definitely weak, and I do wish this had actually seen the inside of a courtroom. So long as Yuzu hadn't done anything very stupid in the background, we're never going to know exactly what Nintendo had. But if we take a look at alternative Switch emulators, they are still available right now online. They are fully legal, open source, permissible to use until a court decides otherwise. That is why you see all of these available emulators, and you can go and download them right now. This settlement affects that in no way, shape, or form. If you want to go play Ryujinx, you can. If Nintendo wants to stop them from actively developing an emulator, they would have to file a very similar lawsuit against the makers of this emulator and try to do the exact same thing. And for the commenters that say there's no reason to emulate Switch, there's plenty of reasons. There's plenty of enhancements that are available. And again, Ryujinx is going to do something like open sourcing their code, which means that even if Nintendo decided to pursue this emulator, the source code is still going to be available online. People are going to download the repros the minute they hear a whiff of lawsuit, and it's going to be available into the future. You can go through all of the source code. This is just the memory mapping and address spacing right here, but you can take a look under the hood and see how absolutely everything is done. This would basically be Nintendo playing a game of whack-a-mole. They have taken down Yuzu and Citra as far as the repros are concerned, and Tropical Haze and its members can no longer develop the emulator, but that has nothing to do with everybody else. Nintendo would have to file dozens of lawsuits, and here's the thing about the court system. In the United States, in the UK, Australia, and other countries, it is going to be friendly to somebody like Nintendo because the copyright and IPs are considered to be something fundamentally defendable. There's other countries in the world that these could be developed in where the court system and the government would basically say, go pound sand, we don't care, we will do whatever the hell we want. The globe does not work the same way. Every country has different laws, and that's just how it is. And because a precedent wasn't set, it doesn't matter what happens in the future. Now, my true opinion on why this happened is we know the Switch 2 is coming at some point in time. Nintendo has been stalling this thing for forever, but think how easy it was to emulate the Switch and how much better emulation is than an actual Switch. You can get to 4K 60 on Tears of the Kingdom on Yuzu. You're getting nowhere near that on an actual Switch handheld. The new hardware for Nintendo is of course going to be based, at least in part, on NVIDIA hardware, and even if it is custom bespoke silicon, they have talked about having backwards compatibility, and that's what the rumors suggest to be true. To do backwards compatibility of games, you can do that one of two ways. You can go a pure software emulation route and emulate the old system. A lot of consoles do that, but I'm guessing the Switch 2 won't have the power. Or inside of that silicon, in some way, shape, or form, you're going to have the ability to run the instruction sets and all the different GPU calls on the APU inside of the system so that you can run legacy software and even improve on its performance. Basically, I think Nintendo was getting scared that the Yuzu team or somebody else is going to be able to emulate Switch 2 and probably do it in like the first 6 months to a year. The launch window is a huge profit point for any company releasing hardware, and even though they don't make money on the hardware, the sale of the games where they really recoup that investment. So I think a lot of this comes down to Nintendo being afraid that someone was going to try to write an emulator for the Switch 2 because it's going to be based on similar hardware architecture, even if the silicon is a full custom from NVIDIA and not just a Tegra, which was pretty much off the shelf for the original Switch. Nintendo wants the next development team that thinks about doing something to be scared, see that $2.4 million settlement, and think it's not worth my time and effort to start because Big N is going to be looking over my shoulder the entire time. But as far as the current situation is concerned, the settlement is just between one company and Nintendo. It affects absolutely nothing going forward. We don't know how Nintendo is going to act next. Maybe they're going to go after Ryujinx and pretty much every other Nintendo emulator ever made, but I genuinely don't think so, because if they try to see the inside of a courtroom with the argument about the decryption keys and how that circumvents their different rights, I don't think they're going to have a good time. I don't think it's a strong legal argument. I think it's a very ambiguous one, but the problem is that no emulation developer is going to have the type of money to actually go into court with Nintendo unless they have have some sort of rights group backing them financially. Last time we saw this was Sony versus Connectix, and that's because Connectix was a corporation and had deep enough pockets to actually see the inside of a courtroom and win a case, but even then, that case caught them so much, they ended up going bankrupt in the end anyway. But that's the current situation with Yuzu and Citra. The developers behind it can't work on it anymore, they can't distribute it, but there's so many forks and so many repros out there, it'll never die because honestly, this is the internet, nothing ever disappears, it'll always be there. So Nintendo may have won in the short term, but in the long term, I don't think there's ever a way that they see that big W put up on the board. If you have any questions, leave them down below, but we are done. Bye-bye.